Every U.S. president since 1945 could have been indicted and convicted of aggression and war crimes. By the standards of the Nuremberg Code after World War II, Trump is no exception in that. Joe Biden is no exception. Every one of them has been a war criminal. The CIA used to do in secret. The NED does them openly. I have a platform in my run for Congress next year, and it includes abolishing the CIA because it has been essentially a terrorist organization. The NED should also be abolished because it's basically a propaganda agency of meddling. They haven't been promoting democracy. They've been promoting separatism. I don't think it would benefit the people of Hong Kong. Hong Kong legally and historically is part of China. It's dangerous to believe anything you see or hear in the mainstream media. It doesn't represent what's actually going on in the world. The United States and China have many areas where they could be cooperating, but unfortunately, the U.S. empire don't want to lose their privileged position. The United States shouldn't be an exceptional country. I support bringing all U.S. troops home. I think the chances of peace in the world would be greatly improved by the U.S. being kicked out off of the Security Council. The idea of an international rules-based order is talked about by U.S. politicians. It's becoming a laughingstock worldwide. My experience over my whole life in this country is that I have very little say over anything. Certainly no say over my government's policies, domestically or internationally. It's only democracy for the few, for the people who have $1 billion or more. The rest of the population is completely left out. I think what would blow the minds of most Americans is the idea that Chinese democracy might be working better than U.S. democracy. People of China, the majority, feel that they have democracy, and from what they know of the West, they would probably consider it a superior form of democracy to U.S. democracy. U.S. foreign policies are 100% bipartisan, are warlike, aggressive, violent, and the rest of the world is getting tired of it.
Hey guys, it's Keybros. Welcome to a new episode of Soft Talk, where unlike BBC's Hard Talk, the interviewees won't find it hard to talk. So today we're very honored to have a special guest with us. He is Mr. Geoffrey Young, who is from the state of Kentucky. Mr. Young is actually running for the US House of Representatives Congress as a candidate for the Democratic Party in 2022. And he would be challenging in the Kentucky 6th Congressional District. Before running for Congress, Mr. Young was also an assistant director of the State Energy Office of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Let's ask Mr. Young to introduce himself to our audience.
Thank you. My name is Geoffrey Young, and I'm running for the U.S. House of Representatives. I also ran for this same office in 2014 as a Democrat, 2016 as a Democrat, 2018 as a Democrat, and in 2020 I ran as a Republican, and now I'm a Democrat again. I have not been successful in any of those runs, but I continue to learn. I have become familiar with how corrupt Kentucky politics are.
Thank you very much. How do you view the contemporary U.S. foreign policy?
It's a disaster. It is basically imperialistic in nature. The United States did actually dominate the world in the years after World War II ended. 1945 through perhaps 1960s, the United States had a dominant position economically and militarily. It may be culturally too, but that situation is changing now. It's becoming a multipolar world, which is the norm in human history. It's very unusual to have one dominant country in the entire world. The people who run the United States, the billionaires, the military, industrial, media, intelligence complex, basically the capitalist class, and they don't want to lose their privileged position as the world's dominant power. So they're resisting that, and as a result, US policies are warlike, aggressive, violent, and the rest of the world is getting tired of it.
What should be the main strategy in terms of dealing with China from the perspective of the US? Do you think it should be cooperation, competition, or something in between?
Ideally, the United States would cooperate with all countries. In fact, I'm going to quote a politician that I don't admire very much, but Donald Trump said one interesting thing when he was a candidate running for president in 2020. Wouldn't it be nice if we got along with China and Russia and all these countries? So I agree with former President Trump about that. It would increase the likelihood that humanity will continue to exist and not have a nuclear war. The United States and China have many areas where they could be cooperating, but unfortunately, the U.S. empire don't want to lose their privileged position. Therefore, they have taken a very hostile position toward China and Russia and Iran, and that's dangerous for everyone.
Just now you mentioned that you're not particularly a big fan of President Trump. Is there a reason why you think that way?
He was an imperialist, a war criminal, but every U.S. president since 1945 has been aggressive, has violated international law continuously. Trump is no exception in that. Joe Biden is no exception. Every one of them has been a war criminal. By the standards of the Nuremberg Code after World War II, every U.S. president could have been indicted and convicted of aggression and war crimes. That has to end.
What do you think about the National Endowment for Democracy, or the NED?
It's a CIA front. A few years ago, the director of it proudly boasted that the CIA used to do in secret, the NED does them openly. What that means is meddles in the politics of any country in the world. The NED supports politicians in as many other countries as it can who go along with US imperialism and will serve the wishes of the empire. So I have a platform in my run for Congress next year, and it includes abolishing the CIA because it has been essentially a terrorist organization, a criminal organization since the day it was founded in 1947. And I would add to that plank of my platform that the NED should also be abolished because it's basically a propaganda agency of meddling.
Every member of the public can actually go onto the NED website and see that they have spent millions of dollars in, promoting democracy or whatsoever. What do you make of the NED's involvement here in Hong Kong, where we are based?
They haven't been promoting democracy. They've been promoting separatism. Hong Kong legally and historically is part of China. So is Taiwan. The NED and the British intelligence have for decades been trying to use Hong Kong as a means of meddling in the political affairs of China itself. And they're losing that bridgehead in Asia. China recently made Hong Kong subject to Chinese law, which I think is a positive development from the point of view of China's independence. The imperial powers are no longer going to be able to use Hong Kong to try to subvert the government of China. The NED is probably going to be expelled from Hong Kong. I think that would be good.
What do you make of these Hong Kong student leaders who frequently travel to the US to meet with people in Congress?
I think it's unfortunate. They're being used by the CIA and by the empire to try to create turmoil in Hong Kong. Their goal is to separate from China. I don't think that's a realistic goal. I don't think it would benefit the people of Hong Kong. My understanding is that the majority of the people of Hong Kong are happy with being a region of China. So only a minority that wishes to become independent. The purpose of NED is to create division in Hong Kong. I don't think it's succeeding in that.
What drove you to decide to run as a Democrat?
U.S. foreign policies are 100% bipartisan. There is no significant difference between the foreign policies of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So my interest in peace is not represented in either dominant political party. There are tiny parties in the United States as well, but they can be ignored because the existing electoral system supports only the two big ones. I was a Green briefly from 2009 to 2013, and they simply have no effect. They're so tiny, I decided I would have to run as a Democrat or a Republican. Why did I switch to Republican in 2020? Because the Kentucky Democratic Party is totally corrupt. They routinely rig their own primaries to prevent anyone radical from ever being nominated. They simply violate the law. There are laws against rigging your own primaries in Kentucky, at least, and probably in many other states.
Would you ever consider running as a libertarian? Because listening to what you've said so far, your platform reminds me a lot of Joe Jorgensen, who ran for president in 2020. Do you think that's a possibility?
I've considered that idea many times over the last 7 years, but I've never done it. I have a good friend who ran as a libertarian for the same U.S. congressional seat. I guess he ran in 2018 and 2020, and I supported his campaign. Basically, he was the only pro-peace candidate on the ballot. The norm in the United States is pro-war Democrats and pro-war Republicans. So I'll support anyone who's pro-peace, but I won't run as a libertarian because I think they have a naive view of economics. They don't like government regulation. And I think often government regulation, for example, of environmental pollution is necessary. Libertarians don't tend to support that. I agree with libertarians on foreign policy. They have a live and let live attitude. They don't like huge budgets for the military because they are very concerned about the federal budget deficit. So I agree with them on some things, but I'll never become a libertarian unless they become major party, and I would seriously consider it. Right now, they're negligible.
In one of your manifestos, you've talked about supporting bringing US troops out of the Middle East entirely. So can you explain a bit about your position there?
They are a force for chaos, destabilization, and war. They're not a force for peace at all. I support bringing all US troops home and cutting the so-called defense budget by at least 60%. The United States basically never demobilized militarily after World War II. Every other country in the world demobilized. It's crippling our economy. We can't afford it. People in every region where we have troops don't want us there. The Middle East would be much more peaceful if all US troops were withdrawn. In fact, Iran in 2020 announced a long-term strategic goal of getting all US troops out of the Middle East. I think it's a good idea.
What do you make of the role of international institutions like the UN or NATO?
I think NATO should be abolished immediately. Since 1991, when the USSR disintegrated, NATO has been an alliance without a purpose. And now it's a major force for war, not only in Europe and the North Atlantic, but all over the world. There are NATO troops in Afghanistan, nowhere near the North Atlantic. If the countries of Europe wish to have a defensive military alliance, they should definitely get the US out of it. NATO has been historically a tool of US imperialism. Right now, there are exercises going on, military war games, very close to the borders of Russia. Highly provocative and destabilizing. There was an incident the other day, a British destroyer knowingly and intentionally entered Russian territorial waters in the Black Sea. That almost ended in a military clash. So NATO has to go. UN is very necessary institution. That should be preserved. The countries of the world need a place where people can discuss their differences and try to resolve them without war. That's the purpose of the UN. But I propose a reform in the UN whereby the United States would be kicked off of the Security Council forever and remain a member of the General Assembly and become a normal country. The United States shouldn't be an exceptional country. I've never agreed with US exceptionalism.
Do you think all 5 permanent member seats should be removed, or should it only be the US?
I think the chances of peace in the world would be greatly improved by the US being kicked out off of the Security Council. Maybe additional reforms after that would help even more. I just don't know. It's kind of theoretical at this point.
What do you think of the role of international law in general?
I'm a strong supporter of international law. I think the laws are fine. The problem is the United States has never felt bound by them. Since the UN Charter was signed in 1945 by the US, it became binding law in the United States, but the US has never abided by international law. The US has been using international law as a tool for imperialism, and NATO has been doing the same thing.
What do you make of the international rule-based order that Secretary of State Blinken always emphasized?
It's bullshit. The rule-based order is talked about by US politicians. It simply means a rule of the jungle. Might makes right. We have the gold, so we make the rules. Cynical version of the golden rule. It's a joke. Will subvert your government if you don't do whatever the United States says. It's becoming a laughingstock worldwide.
What do you make of the accusation that we are engaging in what's called wolf warrior diplomacy? Do you think China's foreign policy has been too aggressive, or do you think the Western nations are simply exaggerating the threat that China supposedly poses to the world?
I have very few problems with Chinese foreign policy or Russian foreign policy or Iranian foreign policy. I think China has recently, in the past couple of years, become much more assertive and outspoken in putting its views forward. For example, the latest summit meeting in Alaska between China and the United States, Chinese delegation expressed themselves much more forcefully than I've ever seen. And I think that's a good thing. I think subtlety is lost on the US government. They mistake subtlety for weakness. And so I'm pleased to see the increase in bluntness being expressed by China and Russia. My criticisms of Western imperialism are intense virtually every day on social media. And I don't see China and Russia as imperialist powers. I see their foreign policy primarily as defensive and cooperative in nature. China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, appears to be seeking win-win solutions everywhere in the world. Trade and non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. That's the exact opposite of US foreign policy today, which depends on economic sanctions, cutting off trade, embargoes, which are illegal, and win-lose. They're interested in US domination.
So what do you make of these allegations of genocide in Xinjiang?
They're fraudulent. Reports I've seen by US-based alternative media organizations such as the Gray Zone and by my friends in Asia suggest the entire accusation of genocide has been fabricated. It's simply not happening. There's no truth to it. There are a very small number of so-called researchers who simply make things up. I think Adrian Zenz is the leading propagandist promoting the genocide accusation. Delegations from many countries have been to Xinjiang and have not found any evidence of genocide or mistreatment of the Uyghur people. By reading all of this data, I have become convinced that China's policy basically is to improve the economy in all of its rural provinces, including Xinjiang, and thereby reduce people's tendencies to consider terrorism as an option. China has been fighting terrorism in Xinjiang. The East Turkestan group, basically terrorist organizations supported by the CIA and the NED, I suppose. China has been trying to defend itself against international terrorism. And I think it has done a pretty good job. It's taken the opposite strategy once again from the United States, where the United States addressed what it considered terrorism in Afghanistan by invading and occupying the country. China has not done that. They've fostered economic development instead.
In recent years, we've seen the rise of what's so-called the new wing of the Democratic Party, like Ocasio-Cortez. Do you think they pose a credible challenge to the mainstream Democratic Party, who seem to be basically one and the same with the Republicans?
I was happy when Ocasio-Cortez was elected. I'm glad that she was able to defeat a long-term neoconservative Democrat. She got rid of one of more violent members of Congress. I think it would be an overestimation to call it a wing. I think it's more like a feather. I would certainly work with them if I ever get elected, but I don't think that they have any influence. Bernie Sanders in the Senate, similarly, better than average, but very little influence.
What sort of electoral reform would you like to see in the US so that you guys can have more politicians that truly care about the people?
The most important thing is to get big money out of politics. That is going to be very difficult. It's going to take a while. Money in politics has essentially corrupted our entire political system. The cost of campaigning continues to skyrocket, and there seems to be no limit to the spending. In Kentucky, in 2020, a neoconservative pro-war Democrat, Amy McGrath, challenged Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. She actually raised more money than he did, $80 million, and she lost. So the money is just out of control. That's the main thing that needs to change. I also support ranked choice voting or preferential voting, whereby if there were 5 candidates running in a primary, you would get 4 votes. If your first choice is eliminated in the first round, it gets the fewest votes, then your second vote would count. And there'd be enough rounds until one of the 5 would get a majority, over 50%. That could help a lot. I favor public financing of all elections. Just get the money out of it. Other countries have somehow been able to do that. The United States should do the same.
So what do you make of mainstream media in the United States right now?
Thank you for asking that question. One of my teachers in the past was Noam Chomsky, and he and Edward Herman wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent, and they focused on the US mainstream media, concluded that it's basically a propaganda system. And I agree with their thesis. Noam Chomsky said in 1976 in that class at MIT, totalitarian governments depend on the rule of force, arresting dissidents and anyone who challenges the dictator. In Western democracies, they depend mainly on the media and propaganda to remain in power. Not support from the public, but consent. They need the public not to get out there every day in numbers of 500,000 people in Washington, D.C. and simply demonstrate against the government. They really don't want that to happen. It's dangerous to believe anything you see or hear in the mainstream media. It represents what the elite, what the government, what the system wants you to think. It doesn't represent what's actually going on in the world.
Do you think, in some sense of the word, China is actually more democratic than the US?
Yes, I do. And that's a very unpopular position in the United States. The mainstream media talk all the time about freedom and democracy and the free market. But what is democracy? Democracy is when regular people have some say and some influence over the conditions that affect them. China definitely does not have electoral democracy. I learned recently China has many parties. I didn't know that until a couple months ago. But they're not allowed to take power. Only the Communist Party of China is allowed to run the country. It's not Western style, US style democracy by any means. But my experience over my whole life in this country is that I have very little say over anything. Certainly no say over my government's policies, domestically or internationally. And the reason I have no say is I'm not a billionaire. So the United States and other Western countries have a kind of democracy, but it's only democracy for the few, for the people who have $1 billion or more. They get to practice democracy among themselves. The rest of the population is completely left out. There have been academic studies on this that show that the top 5% of wealth and income part of the population actually have some influence over policies, and the 95% have virtually none. I'm not an expert on China, but it seems to me that at the local level, the Communist Party of China makes an effort to find out what people really think and what they want. And they actually respond and try to give people what they want. I think that's meaningful democracy. People of China, the majority, feel that they have democracy. And from what they know of the West, they will probably consider it a superior form of democracy to US democracy. Would that be accurate? People you talk with, do they feel that way?
Yeah, I would say so. People do enjoy the way of life in China, even though it might be so-called undemocratic according to the mainstream media, but they do really think they have democracy.
China consistently ranks very high in terms of approval rating, especially compared to the US and the UK. If you look at the Pew Research Center statistics, only 20% of people in the UK think that their democracy is working well, but over 90% of people in China approve of the communist government. And I think most of the grievances that they have are mostly directed to corrupt local officials, but they're very much pleased with the central government, who's at the moment trying their best to crack down on corruption.
I think what would blow the minds of most Americans is the idea that Chinese democracy might be working better than US democracy. I'm going to say that on the campaign trail and see what the reaction is. I'll probably be called insane.
Another part of your manifesto is that you support Medicare for all. So what do you think of Obamacare?
It was a half measure at best. Very early in the negotiations with President Obama, took the public option off the table. I think what we ended up with was not a very good result. I mean, it helped a lot of people. More people got health insurance than before. I'd give it a grade of D. I wouldn't give it a failing grade. The particular legislation I proposed was proposed for many years by U.S. Representative John Conyers of Detroit, Michigan. He called it the Expanded Improved Medicare for All Act. Since he left Congress and died a couple of years later, it has been watered down, but I'd reintroduce the original version. It allows a for-profit health sector to continue to operate, but it basically makes the entire U.S. health system nonprofit. Not government controlled, as I think the British system was, but nonprofit. It takes a big source of inefficiency and waste out of the system. So I would support that.
Obviously, people on the right-wing spectrum of the political compass would argue that the government tends to be more ineffective in dealing with resources in the private sector. So how would you respond to that?
I would say look at every other advanced country in the world. Look at their results. The United States simply has worse health results and vastly higher costs than any other modern country. You have to say, what are they doing right? What are we doing wrong? I went to public school in Massachusetts, and I was happy with that. I think it was a pretty good education there. But a few towns over in a working class community, the education might have been terrible. Unfortunately, in the US, it's income dependent, where you live. This is a capitalist country. It's owned and run by capitalists. It's structurally set up to benefit the wealthy. Western European countries have managed to temper that tendency to siphon all the wealth into the top 1%. There is a possibility of making things better through reform, but I don't think the core imperialist country in the world, United States, is going to be able to change its system very much without a revolution. I would hope that that revolution is nonviolent. I'm strongly committed to nonviolent revolution. That's what I think will be necessary. The alternative is collapse, complete collapse, much like the USSR after 1991, where it became economic gangsterism. That's a real possibility in the United States. Collapse of the government, descent into economic gangsterism and warlords running around the United States. I don't think any American wants to see that.
This reminds me of what President Putin said lately, which is the US is probably following the footsteps of the former Soviet Union. Thank you very much to Geoffrey for coming on to our show. It's a huge pleasure to have him on.
Thank you guys for watching this video as well. If you liked our video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to Keybros by pressing the red below.
I have a webpage, youngforkentucky.com. That's my campaign website.
Cool. So thank you very much. See you guys in the next episode. Bye.